These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. Black to move. What is the best move? Two enemy pieces on the same diagonal call for consideration of a skewer by your bishop or queen. White saw black's rook and knight so aligned here, and then played bishop moves to d2, now black faces a skewer and the threat that he will lose the exchange, or, if the rook moves, that he will lose his knight. Black's only interposition queen moves to f4 is worse than useless. He has a check in rook takes at g2, but it loses the rook for a pawn and so defeats the purpose of breaking out of the skewer. What remains? A mate threat, of course. Black's queen attacks h2, adjacent to white's king. If he had further support for an attack against that square, he could threaten mate. Can either of the black pieces in the skewer leave their squares with an attack against h2? Yes, black can play knight moves to g4. Now white has to worry that black will play queen takes at h2, check. And then, after the reply king moves to f1, queen moves to h1, checkmate. After white takes defensive measures to prevent this, example pawn from f2 moves to f4, black has time to move his rook. White's threat is extinguished. Notice that black had another option as well, moving the middle piece his rook not with check but with a threat against white's queen via rook moves to e5. The rook would have protection from the pawn on f6. Since the threat black creates with this is larger than the gain white could obtain from following through with bishop takes knight, he has to abandon the skewer in favor of a retreating move with his queen like queen moves to d1. There is, however, a kicker. Black needs to spend his next move protecting or relocating his knight. It is about to get taken for free otherwise. After that, white can pin black's rook to its queen with bishop moves to f4. Black to move. What is the best move? Beware of leaving your pieces lined up on the same rank. They may get skewered, as has happened here to black. White saw black's queen and knight so aligned, and thus played his rook to c6 with protection from his bishop on f3. There is no room to interpose anything, and black has no way to give check with his queen that does not lose it on the spot. And this time he has no mating threats. Now what options remain? If you are in black's shoes, you mustn't allow the threat you face to distract you from your usual tasks, including a scan of the lines leading away from white's king. In this case, the scan reveals that white's rook can be pinned. Black plays rook moves to c8 and the skewering threat is over. White cannot legally play rook takes queen, he can play rook takes rook, but then black recaptures rook takes rook, check. And it's a wash. Strategic implications. Now some strategic pointers. First, the best skewers tend to run through kings, and you can turn this point into a strategic caution against sending your king out from the back rank. Late in the game such travels can be important because the king may have good offensive uses, but you always need to worry about skewers as soon as the king ventures forth onto the board. Endgames with mobile kings on a relatively open field often are dominated by threats of pins and skewers. Earlier in the game, when the king doesn't serve offensive purposes, because you have other pieces for that, a more retiring attitude is appropriate and helps keep skewers away. Putting the king with its back to the wall generally is good practice. One also wants to keep an eye on the files to the side of it, and particularly the h-file when castling has occurred on the king's side. An open h-file can lead to fine skewers when a heavy piece runs down it and ends up aimed through a king on the back rank. A few other morals may be derived from the relative skewers we saw. One involves how you protect your pieces. We know that loose pieces are prey to unexpected tactical strikes of many different kinds. Skewers are yet another addition to the list. The same goes for pieces protected only by other pieces. They may be loosened or become as good as loose when enough offensive pressure is put on them or their guardians, and then become targets for skewers, or forks, or black. These risks are much reduced when a piece is guarded by a pawn, for then if it is taken its replacement the recapturing pawn is not an attractive target for a follow-up attack. All this also helps explain the importance of maintaining control of the center, or at least keeping a pawn there. The pawn can serve to protect a piece from being captured or loosened too easily, and in turn the piece can do good offensive work because it is stationed out where it can reach lots of points on the enemy's side of the board. Finally, there is the recurring significance of open lines. The bishop is the most often useful of the skewering pieces because it typically can get out from behind your pawns and onto good lines more easily than your rooks can, and because the bishop is worth little enough that it profitably can threaten lots of enemy pieces including protected rooks. Bishops, like rooks, are at their best and most capable of executing skewers when they have open lines on which to run. So here as elsewhere, much of the relevant strategy comes down to controlling the center and thinking carefully about the arrangement of pawns there and in other sectors. The placement of pawns determines the openness of the lines on the board, and so is a great determinant of how tactically useful your pieces will be. White to move. What is the best move? Removing the guard. Capturing the guard. Introduction to the section, simple cases. Suppose you make a threat against one of your opponent's pieces, perhaps your knight attacks his bishop, and the bishop is loose. He can respond either by moving the bishop or by guarding it. If he guards it, you now have a second offensive focus besides the bishop, the guard itself. Undermining it can become your immediate task or can hover as an ongoing issue in the game. With time, more such issues come up. At any given moment several of your pieces may be aimed at pieces, pawns, and possible mating squares belonging to your opponent. A critical question in every position is whether those points you have under attack can be made vulnerable. They all may have guards, but can the guards be captured, or blocked, or driven or lured away? This section is devoted to methods for achieving those aims, ways of removing or disabling the pieces that guard targets in the enemy camp. It covers material that has been labeled in a wide range of ways in the literature, including terms such as destruction, deflection, diversion, decoying, damming, draw away, driving off, breaking communication, blockading, overloading, attraction, interference, interception, and obstruction. While some of those terms have useful meanings, on the whole the proliferation of jargon is unfortunate. All of those devices can be assimilated under the heading of removing the guard. We can then subdivide this theme into 4 methods, 4 ways to loosen a piece or square you would like to take. A. You can capture the guard. B. You can attack the guard, i.e., threaten it so that it becomes obliged to leave its square. C. You can take something else the guard protects, distracting it, or demonstrating that it is overworked. Or, D. Perhaps you can interpose something between the guard and its protectorate, interfering with the defensive work the guard is trying to do. Each of those themes gets a chapter of its own in this section. We have seen most of them in earlier chapters as ways to create forks and other tactical strikes. They are the methods we have used to loosen targeted pieces or to loosen the square needed to impose a fork or pin, etc. Here we focus on them as ways of loosening pieces and mating squares so that you can capture or occupy them straight away. Our first theme involves capturing the guard, simply taking it, so that its protectorate becomes loose. We begin with simple examples like the position to the left. In this section, as in the others, we will be dwelling on a single technique to guide our searches. In this case it will be to ask what enemy pieces you threaten, and then investigating whether the threat can be made to work. Here, then, you start by noticing that your rook attacks black's bishop, which is protected by a pawn and rook. And your queen attacks black's knight, which is protected by black's bishop. In those observations lie a tactical idea: play both captures in succession. First comes rook takes bishop, removing the knight's guard. Black's recapture rook takes rook momentarily wins the exchange but replaces the bishop with a rook that no longer can guard the knight on g4. Now white plays queen takes knight, winning 2 pieces for a rook. Black has a defensive idea here, by the way, that doesn't quite work but is important to notice. He can reply to rook takes bishop by taking the offensive with knight takes at f2. Now black has picked up a pawn and he attacks 2 pieces at once. His knight, which was a goner anyway, attacks white's queen, and his rook, and also his f7 pawn, attacks white's rook. The move fails to impress, though, because white can keep pressing his rook forward with rook takes rook, check. Not only taking a rook but inflicting a check that black has to fend off. Now white is the one who attacks 2 pieces at the same time. Black can play rook takes rook, but then white has another move he can spend taking black's knight or moving his own queen to safety. So knight takes at f2 doesn't help black here, he ends up trading rooks and losing a piece for a pawn. But the idea behind knight takes at f2 is valuable. When one of your pieces is taken, as happens to black here when white plays rook takes bishop, you might be able to profit by delaying or forfeiting your recapture and instead playing a threat of your own elsewhere. If black's pieces were arranged a little differently, the idea would have helped him to reduce his losses here. Now return to the correct sequence. 1. Rook takes bishop, rook takes rook, 2. Queen takes knight, and see what can be learned from it. You already know from prior studies that it is dangerous to send a piece out onto the board loose, i.e., with no protection. Even if it sits on a square that is not being attacked, such a piece easily can become the subject of a fork and get taken for nothing. Here black avoided that problem in part. All of his pieces were protected, but they were not protected equally well. The bishop was protected by a pawn, and so was very safe in the sense that it could not itself be taken profitably. The knight, however, was protected not by a pawn but by a fellow piece. It often is hazardous to venture a piece into enemy territory with no better protection than a fellow piece farther back on the board. This position shows why. A knight advanced to close range, like black's knight here, is easy for white to attack. It then becomes only as safe as the piece that defends it, black's bishop. Even if that bishop is well protected by a pawn, the pawn provides no security against the risk that white can throw a piece at the bishop even with a sacrifice, as where white uses his rook in this case and thus cause an exchange that leaves the knight loose. All this shows why the better practice usually is to avoid planting a knight in enemy territory until you have created a suitable home for it, a square protected by a pawn. It would be too much to state this as a rule. Like everything in chess, it depends on the position, and sometimes the benefits of putting your knight in a riskier position outweigh the costs. The important thing is just to be aware of the dangers involved in protecting pieces with pieces. Black to move. What is the best move? Again, the pieces at issue all are protected but aren't equally secure. Black attacks white's bishop with one of his rooks and he attacks white's rook with the other. The bishop is protected by a pawn, and so cannot itself be taken with any gain. White's rook is protected by his bishop. So first black takes the bishop with rook takes bishop. After white recaptures with his pawn, white's rook is left to be taken with rook takes rook. To put it more simply, you ask why you cannot play rook takes rook, and see that the rook is protected by the bishop, so you capture the bishop. Removing the guard requires you to think backwards. You notice something you might be able to take but see that it has protection. Instead of dismissing the idea as unworkable, you ask how the piece is protected and whether you might change that. Thus you never stop with the conclusion that a piece is protected, you always finish the sentence, protected by what? White to move. What is the best move? White's rook is under attack by black's king. He has to move it. Before retreating, though, think about ways of taking the offensive. What does white himself threaten? His king attacks black's rook in mirror image fashion. The position basically is symmetrical, of course. The rook is guarded by the knight, so white simply removes the knight from the board, rook takes knight, check. This forfeits the exchange, but for the sake of loosening black's rook. However, black recaptures, white has king takes rook next move and wins a piece. Black to move. What is the best move? You want to be thinking all the time about any enemy pieces you can capture and what guards them. Here black would like to play king takes rook, but the rook is guarded by a pawn. But he can take out the pawn with rook takes at f5, once white recaptures, rook takes rook, check, the white rook on g6 is left loose, so black takes it with his king. He nets a pawn and takes control of the rest of the game. We have seen that pieces tend to be especially vulnerable when they are guarded by other pieces rather than by pawns. But as this position shows, even an enemy piece protected by a pawn may present an opportunity to make gains. White to move. What is the best move? To repeat the key introductory point, before thinking about what move to make, consider what points you currently attack in the enemy camp and whether any of the possibilities can be made profitable. Here white has two captures to consider, queen takes queen and bishop takes knight. What prevents queen takes queen from succeeding? The protection black's queen enjoys from his knight. So white eliminates the defender with bishop takes knight, check. After black replies pawn from b7 takes bishop c6, white takes black's queen for free. Notice the check white's bishop gave when it captured the knight. The check is critical, as otherwise black replies queen takes queen, check. And then after his queen is retaken plays pawn from b7 takes bishop c6 a wash. Giving check with the capture denies black the time to make mischief with the piece that has just been stripped of its guard. White to move. What is the best move? Focusing again on what captures you might make, you see that your bishop attacks black's knight and that your queen attacks and is attacked by black's queen. The pressing issue is that black is about to play queen takes queen, as your queen is loose. You could force the exchange of queens first with queen takes queen, after which black recaptures knight takes queen, or you could move your queen or protect it with a pawn. But all this would be unambitious. Consider how you might seize the initiative. In this case, consider in particular what would be needed for you to take black's queen at a profit. As we saw, its only guard is the knight. Okay, so take the knight, play bishop takes knight, and if black replies pawn from e6 takes bishop, you have queen takes queen. More likely, black would reply to bishop takes knight with queen takes queen, but then white plays bishop takes queen and still has won a piece. When you are trying to kick the legs out from under the enemy queen so you can take it for free, you have to be careful, it's a dangerous type of hunt. Generally you will be planning to play queen takes queen. If you have a lesser piece than your queen aimed at your opponent's queen, you typically take it without bothering to remove the guard. But if queen takes queen is available to you, it also is available to your opponent. You therefore have to find a way to remove the enemy queen's protection that doesn't allow him to just reply queen takes queen and ruin your idea. In the previous frame, we dealt with this by giving check when white captured the queen's guard, thus there was no time for the enemy to play queen takes queen. In the current frame we deal with the risk by ensuring that when white captures the queen's guard he also supplies a defender for his own queen. The result is that when white recaptures after black's queen takes queen, he takes his bishop out of range of the pawn on e6. If that weren't so, the sequence here wouldn't work. Black to move. What is the best move? What captures are available to black? Bishop takes knight and queen takes queen. Both queens are protected, but that is only an invitation to probe deeper into the strength of the protection. White's queen is guarded by his knight, and the knight can be taken. Thus if black plays bishop takes knight, white's queen suddenly is bereft of protection. Now of course white would not be inclined to play the recapture pawn from e3 takes bishop, permitting his queen to be taken by black on the next move. Instead he will send his exposed queen on a suicide run, queen takes queen. But then black has bishop takes queen and wins a piece with the sequence. Notice the delicacy of it all. Here as in the last case, the sequence works only because the bishop that removes the guard continues to protect black's queen against queen takes queen, thus enabling black to both make the recapture and evacuate the bishop from danger with the same move. The lesson repeats, when you are removing the enemy queen's guard, you have to think carefully about the danger that he will reply queen takes queen, make sure either that he cannot do it or that if he does, you will have a recapture that does not leave one of your other pieces in the lurch. White to move. What is the best move? The cluster of pieces on the left side of the board might seem hard to untangle. The two rooks that attack each other on the fifth rank both are protected by pawns, so what can be done with them? Meanwhile white's knight is under attack by a pawn, and presumably must flee to white's half of the board since all the squares it can reach on black's side are guarded. But this line of thinking would be all wrong. Holding the initiative is important. Think offense before defense. It's really simple. White wants to play rook takes rook, it doesn't work because of the pawn on c6, so first he takes out the pawn with knight takes at c6, check. After black recaptures with knight takes knight, white plays rook takes rook and has won a rook and a pawn for a knight. Notice again the power of the check. Everything here depends on the fact that knight takes at c6 is an attack on black's king and thus keeps black busy for a move. If it were not, if black's king were on, say, e8 then knight takes at c6 is met by black with rook takes rook. After white recaptures pawn from d4 takes rook, black has knight takes knight and ends up winning a piece for a pawn. When you're trying to make a capture and the pieces involved are making symmetrical attacks, queen against queen, or rook against rook, you always have to consider the possibility that the other side will try to play queen takes queen, or, here, rook takes rook, before you do. White to move. What is the best move? The striking feature of this position should be the open, devoid of pawns, f-file, and particularly the kernel of a discovery that white has there, his knight masks his queen. The black target on the other side, the knight on f7, is protected. Well, but by what? The bishop on e8. So the discovery can be executed and the guard eliminated with the same blow, knight takes bishop. Black recaptures rook takes knight, and now the f7 knight is loose, permitting queen takes knight with the gain of a piece. There are 2 points to take away from this frame. The first is the importance of keeping in mind different tactical tools and ways you can use them together. The logic of the discovered attack can be joined with the capture of a guard in powerful ways. The second point is that it is common during a game for minor pieces to be aimed at each other. One of your knights or bishops often will be pointed at one of your opponent's knights or bishops, with the pieces on both sides having enough protection, and with the pieces at stake similar enough in value, to make the situation seem stable. Remember when you see such a pattern that if either side pulls the trigger and so forces a trade of pieces, the consequences can be very significant, not for the pieces exchanged, but for anything they use to protect. Minor pieces frequently are used as supports for other pieces, which after a capture and recapture may be left loose and thus become good targets for forks or discoveries. So when either side has an unexecuted opportunity to capture a minor piece, think habitually about whether such a capture would have the side effect of removing a guard. White to move. What is the best move? What does white attack? Not much. It might initially seem, his c1 rook and his bishop each attack a pawn, and both pawns are protected. But combine these inquiries with the other studies we have made elsewhere. Find a chance for a fork by stepping back from the board and looking for a geometrical pattern in black's position, or look for any checks you can give, or imagine those pawn captures just mentioned. In any of these ways you want to see that bishop takes at d5, check. Is a pretty triangular bishop fork of black's king and rook. The move won't yet work, of course, because d5 is guarded by a knight. But the first thought then is to destroy the guard if you can. White plays knight takes knight, and after the recapture pawn from a5 takes knight the fork bishop takes at d5, check. Works nicely. This position is no different from several studies in the chapter on bishop forks showing how they can be set up by loosening the forking square. The point of including the position now is to show again how the ideas considered here relate to our earlier work, and also to serve as a reminder that when you look for points you attack in the enemy camp you start with enemy pieces at which your forces are aimed, but do not end there, look as well for sensitive squares, e.g., forking squares and mating squares. More on this later. White to move. What is the best move? Cases involving multiple steps. The positions so far in this section have enabled you to remove the guard with one move and take the piece it protected a move later. Now let's see how the same ideas work in positions involving an additional step or two. In this first example, White's queen is loose and is attacked by Black's queen. White has no way to add protection to it. Should he move it, or perhaps initiate queen takes queen himself? Black's queen is protected by a pawn that White's knight attacks, which seems tantalizing. But as we have seen, one must do better than just capture the guard when trying to loosen a queen. Here Black would reply to knight takes at c6 with queen takes queen. The point is familiar. In this sort of position, the knight must take the pawn with a check that keeps the opponent busy. Unfortunately, knight takes at c6 is not a check, yet it might be turned into one by dragging the king onto a closer square. White therefore starts with rook moves to d8, check. His only check on the board, so inspection of it was mandatory anyhow. After Black plays king takes rook, or king moves to e7, if he somehow prefers it, White's knight takes at c6 is indeed a check. Black has no time for queen takes queen, he must defend his king with queen takes knight. Now the Black queen's protection is gone, and White is the one who plays queen takes queen. To summarize, one rook moves to d8, check. King takes rook, 2. Knight takes at c6, check. Queen takes knight, 3. Queen takes queen wins White a queen and a pawn for a rook and a minor piece. Notice the backward style of reasoning. White starts with the thought of taking Black's queen. He sees that to do this, he first needs to take the pawn behind the queen, but to take the pawn without losing control of the action, he has to give check at the same time, and to give check with that move, he first needs to move Black's king onto a square the knight will be able to reach from c6. So White starts with the check, rook moves to d8, and it looks like he is seeing 3 moves ahead. But it might be more accurate to say that he is seeing 3 moves beneath the position on the board. The issue is not so much extending your ability to see forward in time, it is extending your ability to perceive the chains of cause and effect in front of you. Black to move. What is the best move? The black and white queens attack each other, and both are protected by their knights. Black can't take white's knight, so the position might seem to be deadlocked, but not if you obey the practice of examining your checks. For then you see black's knight moves to f3, check. If white deals with the check by capturing the knight with his rook or g2 pawn, consider the resulting board. Now black's bishop has a clear line to the knight on d4, and bishop takes at d4, check. Is another check that continues to keep white too busy to play queen takes queen. White extinguishes the check with pawn from c3 takes bishop, and then loses his loosened queen to queen takes queen. In effect, black played a discovered attack against the guard of white's queen. In reply to black's original check, knight moves to f3, white also has the better option of moving his king to h1. That ruins black's follow-up of bishop takes at d4 because the move no longer gives check, thus white can instead reply queen takes queen, check. But white's king moves to h1 allows black a different follow-up instead, knight takes knight, also removing the guard. True, it doesn't give check, but now the piece that removes the guard also now protects its queen. Thus when white now plays queen takes queen, check, black can respond with knight takes queen. He has won a piece and moved his knight out of danger. White to move. What is the best move? We still are looking for targets and vulnerabilities in their protection, only now the chain to be examined is a little longer. What does white threaten? His bishop attacks the pawn on c4, and his rook attacks the bishop on d4. Black's bishop is the prize. It is protected by a knight. So white hacks away at the chain with bishop takes at c4, check. This attacks black's knight, which is not worrisome to black in itself since the knight remains protected by a rook. The threat is that if the knight gets taken, the bishop on d4 will be exposed. Normally black could deal with this by just moving his bishop, but not here, for the beauty of bishop takes at c4 is that it checks black's king and leaves him no time to save the bishop. He spends a move relocating his king, and now white plays bishop takes knight. In effect, white has simply played a bishop fork to take out the black bishop's guard. At this point black could recapture with rook takes bishop, to which white would reply by likewise playing rook takes bishop. Black then finishes with rook takes at b2, winning back a pawn but losing a piece with the sequence. Black can do a little better, though. After 1. Bishop takes at c4, check. King moves to f8, 2. Bishop takes knight, each side has a rook that attacks the other side's bishop. But instead of trading pieces, black can play bishop takes at b2, this saves his bishop and picks up a pawn. Now white has to play rook moves to d3 to protect his own bishop, and this gives black time to finish with bishop takes at a3, picking up still another pawn. Black thus ends up with 2 pawns to help offset his loss of a knight, though white has a 1 game in any event. The process of removing the guard often involves exchanges that are a wash in themselves but that leave other pieces loose for the taking. If the guard is protected by a second guard and so forth, you sometimes can start by attacking the last link in the chain, exchanging your way toward a target that will be left loose in the end. But those preliminary exchanges must be studied carefully. They are partially forcing moves, but only partially. Your opponent is likely to reply to your captures with predictable recaptures, but in principle it usually is open to him to decline the recapture and play some other threat that takes the initiative or otherwise ends your threat. That is why it is so valuable to include checks in your sequences when possible, as white does here with bishop takes at c4, check. The check forces your opponent to pick from a short menu of replies, and keeps you in control of the action. White to move. What is the best move? Here is a cautionary tale to illustrate the warnings just offered about removing the guard without paying attention to the side consequences. Ask what white threatens, see that his bishop on b2 attacks a black knight and that his rook on d1 attacks a black bishop. The black knight guards the black bishop. The position seems to call for a classic removal of the guard. White exchanges minor pieces with one. Bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop, and then comes rook takes bishop, with white winning the loosened bishop on d7. But when you imagine this or any sequence of captures, pause to consider how the board will look when the action is over. What will be loose? What lines will be left open? There may be a kicker you can play at the end or a kicker for your opponent. In this case, notice that after the first pair of moves black is left with a bishop aimed at white's rook. So after white plays rook takes bishop, black plays bishop takes rook. Would white then be able to recapture in the corner with rook takes bishop? No, because his rook on d1 would have been used to take black's bishop. So the attempt to win a piece by capturing the guard would end up losing the exchange. This position is worth a good look, as it shows the importance of carefully visualizing each piece vacated from its old square and on a new one. It also shows the importance of considering all of your opponent's possible recaptures. A rudimentary way to blunder here is to imagine that after one bishop takes knight, black would reply pawn from g7 takes bishop. Bishop takes bishop obviously is stronger, since it not only takes aim at white's rook but more generally makes the bishop active and keeps the pawn cover in front of black's king intact. White to move. What is the best move? Do you see an apparent opportunity for white? A pawn in the center always is an important focus of attention. Here black's pawn on e4 is attacked twice by white and guarded once by black, making it possible for white to play knight takes at e4 with impunity. Or so it seems. But before making even a simple capture, assess the board as it would appear afterwards. Once white plays knight takes at e4, what are black's options? What does he threaten? The important answers are the attacks by black's queen on white's queen and by black's knight on white's knight. The fortunes of those attacked pieces are linked. Black can play queen takes queen, check. and then, after the recapture pawn from f2 takes queen, he plays knight takes knight, having loosened white's knight. Another way to see the point is that even at the outset of the position white's queen is under attack by black's queen. This makes the white queen a poor defender of anything else, as it can be eliminated by black in a single stroke. The simple lesson: don't send your pieces on adventures with protection only from fellow pieces that currently are attacked. Actually, there is an even better reply for black here that we will revisit in the chapter on distracting the guard. Perhaps you can see it already. Black, incidentally, notice an idea here for white that nearly saves the day but not quite. After 1. Knight takes at e4, queen takes queen, white almost can play knight takes knight, check. Pushing the same knight onward not only with the capture of an enemy piece but also with a fork of black's king and rook that requires black to spend a move recapturing, the priority of check. And if black plays king moves to e7, white next plays knight takes rook, check. And checks yet again. The only reason this doesn't work is that black's prior move queen takes queen is itself a check that requires white to spend a move replying pawn from f2 takes queen. But all this would give white a fine out if his king were positioned a little differently. Another old lesson repeats: don't take for granted that your opponent will reply to your captures by recapturing. He may be able to make other captures or threats of his own first. The beauty of working with checks is that they avoid those risks. Black to move. What is the best move? When the target is protected twice. Most of the positions just reviewed involved targets that were protected only once. Their guardians may have had guardians, creating lines of protection that had to be traced out, but even then there usually was just one such line of protection to worry about. Often, of course, a piece will be protected 2 or 3 times, in other words, with 2 or 3 chains of guards, short or long, that prevent it from being taken. The logic involved in removing the guard doesn't change much in those cases, but a new wrinkle or two can appear in the resulting patterns. And seeing the tactical opportunities latent in such positions takes a little practice, because to the untrained eye a piece protected 2 or 3 times will not seem vulnerable at all. Yet perhaps it is. And liquidating a position where there are multiple guards on each side also may shake up the board sufficiently to permit a fresh and unexpected tactical blow, a fork or pin or discovery during the sequence or at the end of it. In the study to the left you are playing the black pieces. Your bishop is loose and is threatened by white's queen. A lesser player would move the bishop or add protection to it, but you, the seasoned student of sharp play, step back to inspect your offensive options, starting with a look at what threats you currently make. Your rook attacks the bishop on g2, which is protected by white's king. Your queen and bishop attack the knight on e4, which is protected twice, by white's bishop and queen. A natural idea would be to take out one of the knight's guards with a capture. Rook takes bishop, check. Sacrificing the exchange to gain a piece next move. Since the move is a check, it leaves white no time to reply. Queen takes bishop, he must recapture with king takes rook. Now the knight on e4 is guarded only once and attacked twice. Better still, either capture of it with your bishop or queen, then forks white's king and rook on b1. Observe the triangle. But which way of taking white's knight is best? If you use your bishop, then white moves his king and you win back the exchange with bishop takes rook. If black instead takes the knight with his queen, play might go 3. King moves to h2, queen takes queen, check. A discovered attack against the b1 rook, 4. Pawn from e3 takes queen, bishop takes rook b1, 5. Rook takes bishop. Or 3. Queen takes queen, bishop takes queen, check. 4. King moves to f2, bishop takes rook, rook takes bishop. The final gain in material is the same in all these variations, you end up a whole piece ahead. The difference is that starting with 2. Queen takes knight also ends up eliminating both queens from the board. This is good for familiar reasons. The fewer the pieces left on the board, the more significant your advantage becomes and the harder it is for your opponent to climb back into the game. So a sequence that gets both queens off the board as well as winning a piece generally is better than one that wins a piece without more. White to move. What is the best move? What does white threaten? His rook attacks the bishop on e6. His queen and bishop attack the knight on d5, which in turn is protected by black's queen and bishop. The balance of pressures on the knight are even, but they won't be if one of the knight's guards is exchanged away. White captures one of the knight's guards with rook takes bishop, once more sacrificing the exchange temporarily. No response black can make will save the knight, no matter what he does, it will be 2 attackers against 1 defender. But black's response does have significance, for if he plays queen takes rook and here he has nothing better, he finds his queen fatally pinned a move later by white's bishop takes knight. The potential for this should have been clear from the alignment of 2 of black's pieces with his king. Black can swing his rook over to e8 to protect the queen, but he still ends up trading his queen, a knight, and a bishop for white's bishop and rook. Is it surprising to hear that after white plays 1 rook takes bishop, black has nothing better to do than play queen takes rook and let his queen be pinned? Look at his predicament, his queen is attacked by white's rook. If he doesn't take the rook, then after white plays bishop takes knight, winning his second piece, he will have the kernel of a discovered check and both pieces will be well guarded. Sooner or later black has to sacrifice his queen to forestall checkmate, which now will come soon enough anyway. The position is an example of a theme we will visit several times in this section, the importance when removing the guard of remembering to consider how other tactical tools might be put to work as well. Exchanges to remove a guard, or for any other purpose, often open lines that create openings for pins and forks. In fact, this position could as easily have appeared in the chapter on creating pins. Seen from that standpoint, this would be a case where tracing the lines out from black's king turns up, via bishop takes knight, a potential pin of a bishop an unsuitable target. So white swaps it out for a queen with rook takes bishop, queen takes rook. Now the pin succeeds, as after bishop takes knight the bishop has protection from its own queen.